On a spring evening in 1796 in Philadelphia, then the capital of the United States, the first family of the Republic sat down to dinner. Candles were lit, the table laid, the household moving through its practiced routine. And in the middle of that routine, a 22-year-old woman set down her work, gathered a small bundle she had hidden away, and walked out the door. Her name was Ona Judge. She had been born a slave, and she had just learned that she was to be given away as a wedding gift. So while the most powerful man in America ate his supper, she vanished into the streets and never looked back. What does it mean that the man remembered as the father of American liberty spent 3 years trying to get her back? Ona Judge, the enslaved woman who escaped the household of George Washington and refused, twice, to go back. To understand why she ran, you have to understand what she was born into, and it begins with a death. In 1757, a wealthy Virginia planter named Daniel Parke Custis died without leaving a will. By law, his widow Martha received a life interest in a third of his estate, including some 85 human beings. Martha would soon marry a young colonel named George Washington. But these people were never his to own. They were Custis dower slaves, bound to Martha for her lifetime and destined, at her death, to be divided among her grandchildren like any other inheritance. Into that machinery, around 1773, a girl was born at Mount Vernon. Her mother was a dower slave, and so, from her first breath, they called her Oney. Her father was Andrew Judge, a white English tailor working out his indenture at Mount Vernon. He never publicly claimed her. From her mother, she learned the needle, and she learned it brilliantly. Washington himself would call her the perfect mistress of her needle. At about 10 years old, she was brought up into the mansion to wait on Martha Washington, to dress her, tend her clothes and hair, and be always near. To the family, she was a favored house servant. But one fact cuts through every comfortable image of her life. She was never taught to read. She received, in her own later words, not the least mental or moral instruction of any kind. She was clothed and shown and kept ignorant.
She was brought up and treated more like a child than a servant. I am George Washington, writing of the girl who fled me, September 1796.
When Washington became the first president, slavery moved into the executive mansion with him. An enslaved household served the first family alongside the paid white staff: Hercules the cook, Austin who waited the table, the valet Christopher Shields, and Ona at Martha's side. They lived at the very center of the new republic, close enough to touch its power, and owning none of it. The account books record small kindnesses: theater tickets, a new bonnet, coins for the circus. It is exactly those kindnesses that make household slavery so easy to sentimentalize and so important to see clearly. Washington's own secretary once described it plainly.
They are clothed and fed as well as any laboring people whatever, and they are not subject to the lash of a domineering overseer. But still, they are slaves. Tobias Lear, private secretary to the president.
And it was Martha, more than George, who ruled Ona's daily life. It was Martha's dour interest that had made her a slave. Martha, whom she dressed and served and followed from room to room. We are tempted to picture the elegant First Lady as a bystander to slavery, a gentle woman in a hard system. Her own words resist that. Writing in 1795, Martha Washington set down her opinion of the people she owned.
The blacks are so bad in their nature that they have not the least gratitude for the kindness that may be shewed to them. Martha Washington, in the year 1795.
When the capital moved to Philadelphia, The Washingtons carried their enslaved household into a state that had begun quietly to dismantle slavery. In 1780, Pennsylvania had passed the first gradual abolition law enacted by any elected legislature in the world. It contained a clause that terrified slaveholders. Any enslaved person brought into the state and kept there continuously for 6 months could claim their freedom. The president's own Attorney General, Edmund Randolph, knew the danger firsthand. He had lost enslaved people of his own to this very law. He warned Washington, and quietly, he supplied the way around it.
If, before the expiration of 6 months, they could, upon any pretense whatever, be carried or sent out of the state, but for a single day, a new era would commence on their return. The Council of Attorney General Edmund Randolph relayed to the president, 1791.
Washington took the advice, and he took the deception with it. Every 6 months before the clock could run out, the enslaved staff were rotated out of Pennsylvania and back again, resetting their residency to 0. Martha personally took Ona across the river to Trenton for 2 days, for no reason but to defeat the calendar. And Washington wanted it handled in a very particular way. In a letter to his secretary in the spring of 1791, he set out how and who was to be kept from noticing.
It must be accomplished under pretext that may deceive both them and the public. I am George Washington, instructing my secretary. April 1791.
Read that again. Both them and the public. The scheme was to be hidden not only from Pennsylvanians who might object, but from the enslaved people themselves. So they would never learn that the law standing a few streets away could set them free. For years, Ona Judge lived within walking distance of her own liberty, deliberately kept from knowing it. That was the cage. It was gilded, and it was quiet, and it might have held her for the rest of her life. What broke it open was not cruelty. It was a gift. In the spring of 1796, Martha's eldest granddaughter, Elizabeth Custis, married a man named Thomas Law, and Martha decided to give Ona to her as a wedding present. Ona overheard the plan. Eliza, by Ona's account, had a fierce temper, and to be handed to her meant being carried back to Virginia, out of the free city Ona had come to know, and away from any hope of freedom forever. For a dower slave, this day had always been coming, the day she would be parceled out among the grandchildren. Now it had a name and a date. The abstraction had become a deadline. As Ona put it, with terrible simplicity, she did not want to be a slave always. What she did next took a nerve almost beyond imagining. In the days before the family was to leave for Mount Vernon, Ona quietly carried her few belongings, piece by piece, out of the president's house and into the homes of free black friends in the city. She told no one in the household. Then, on the evening of the 21st of May, 1796, as the Washingtons sat at dinner, she walked out into a network of black Philadelphians who had agreed to hide her. Half a century later, she remembered that night in her own words.
Whilst they were packing up to go to Virginia, I was packing to go. I didn't know where, for I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I should never get my liberty. I had friends among the colored people of Philadelphia, had my things carried there beforehand, and left Washington's house while they were eating dinner. Ona Judge, remembering the night she ran, recounted in 1845.
Notice what she said. I didn't know where. There was no grand plan, no fixed destination, only a door, a decision, and the dark. She hid in the city and then took passage on a ship called the Nancy, bound north for Portsmouth, New Hampshire, under a captain named John Boles. For the rest of her life, she refused to speak his name aloud, and she told the reason plainly.
I never told his name till after he died, a few years since, lest they should punish him for bringing me away. Ona Judge, on the captain who carried her north, 1845.
The archive is silent on the people who made it possible. The free black Philadelphians who hid her things and sheltered her, whose names were never written down. Their courage survives only in its result. Ona reached Portsmouth in the summer of 1796 and might have slipped into a quiet, ordinary freedom. Instead, she was recognized on the street by a young woman named Elizabeth Langdon, a senator's daughter who had known her in the president's circle. Word made its way back to Philadelphia, and the most powerful man in the country began to hunt for her. Washington's response is what turns this from an escape into an indictment. He did not let her go. He pursued her carefully, privately, relentlessly for 3 years. It began with a public mask. 3 days after she ran, an advertisement appeared in a Philadelphia newspaper, signed not by the president but by his steward, Frederick Kitt. It described her in the flat language of property, and it insisted there had been no provocation, a lie that erased her reasons entirely.
Absconded from the household of the President of the United States, Ona Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled, with very black eyes and bushy hair. $10 will be paid to any person who will bring her home. Placed by Frederick Kitt, steward, the Philadelphia Gazette, May 1796.
Then came the private machinery. Learning she was in Portsmouth, Washington wrote to his Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott, and asked him to have the local customs collector seize Ona and put her quietly on a ship back south. He would not use the courts or the Fugitive Slave Act he himself had signed, because a case would become public record and a public pursuit would embarrass him. The collector, Joseph Whipple, agreed to speak with her, but he did not find a girl who had been led astray. He found a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, and he reported it honestly.
A thirst for complete freedom had been her only motive for absconding. Joseph Whipple, customs collector at Portsmouth, to the Treasury. October 1796.
Whipple refused to force her onto a ship. He feared a riot on the docks. But he carried back an extraordinary offer from Ona herself. She would return to the Washingtons willingly, on one condition, that she be granted her freedom when they died. It was a modest, reasonable, almost tender proposal, very nearly the same thing Washington's own will would soon promise his other slaves. His answer, at the end of November 1796, is the moral center of the whole story.
To enter into such a compromise with her, as she has suggested, is totally inadmissible. It would neither be politic, nor just to reward unfaithfulness with a premature preference of freedom, and thereby discontent, beforehand, the minds of all her fellow servants, who by their steady attachments are far more deserving than herself of favor. I am George Washington, November 1796.
Consider what he was refusing. Ona asked for freedom after the Washingtons' deaths, the exact terms his will would shortly grant the people he owned outright. He said no. Not because it was impossible, but because accepting terms from a fugitive woman was intolerable to his sense of order, because it would, in his words, reward unfaithfulness. And there was money in it, too. As Custis dower property, Ona had a cash value. If she were never recovered, Washington would owe her price to the estate. So the pursuit went on. In 1799, he tried one last time through his nephew, Burwell Bassett. Bassett came to Portsmouth to persuade her home. By now, Ona was married to Jack Staines, a free black sailor, with a child of her own. She heard Bassett out, and she gave him his answer.
I am free now, and choose to remain so. Ona Judge, to the nephew of George Washington, Portsmouth, 1799.
But Bassett had come with a second set of orders. If persuasion failed, he was to seize Ona and her infant and carry them off by force. That evening, he dined with a New Hampshire senator, John Langdon, and over dinner, he let the plan slip. Langdon was horrified. He quietly sent word to Ona to run. She took her child and fled into the countryside, to the town of Greenland, and hid. Bassett left empty-handed. A few months later, George Washington was dead, having turned the machinery of the federal government against one young woman, and failed. Freedom, for Ona, was real. It was also very hard. Her husband Jack died in 1803, leaving her a widow, poor, with 3 children she could not support. Her daughters were bound out as servants. Both would die before their mother. In her old age, Ona depended on the charity of others, in a small New Hampshire town, having buried nearly everyone she loved. And she was never, for a single day, safe. In law, she remained a Custis dower slave her entire life. She and her children the property of Martha's heirs, who could have reclaimed them at any time. This is not a story where escape means a happy ending. It is a story of freedom bought at the price of permanent fear. And yet she never once said she was sorry. What she had gained, she measured differently than the ledger did. In Portsmouth, a woman kept illiterate all her life finally learned to read. She found her own faith on her own terms, and she was clear-eyed about the piety of the family that had owned her.
Mrs. Washington used to read prayers, but I don't call that praying. Ona Judge, of the household she escaped, 1845.
Near the end of her life, 2 abolitionist ministers sought her out and wrote down her story, the only first-hand account we have from anyone enslaved in Washington's household. One of them asked the obvious question. She had labored far harder in freedom than she ever had as the pampered maid of a first lady. Did she regret running? Her answer has outlived every mansion and every monument.
No. I am free and have, I trust, been made a child of God by the means. Ona Judge asked if she regretted her escape. 1845.
There is a temptation to make Washington the simple villain of this story. The truth is harder and more useful. He was genuinely, privately troubled by slavery. Alone among the slaveholding founders who became president, he used his will to free the people he owned outright upon Martha's death.
Upon the decease of my wife, it is my will and desire that all the slaves which I hold in my own right shall receive their freedom. George Washington, from his last will and testament, 1799.
But the will reveals the limits as sharply as the conscience. Of the more than 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon, Washington could free only the 124 he owned himself. The rest were Custis dower slaves, Ona among them, and were never his to free. The man who freed his own slaves on paper had spent 3 years hunting one woman who asked for nothing more than that same freedom. And then the nation forgot her. The archive itself was curated against her. The index to Washington's collected papers, one historian noted, records almost everything except the names of the enslaved. She survives through 2 newspaper interviews and a runaway ad. Very nearly, she did not survive at all. That is exactly why she is worth remembering. We are taught that the contradiction of the American founding, liberty proclaimed by men who held human beings as property, was a grand abstraction, debated in the halls of Congress. It was not only that. It lived in the President's house, on Market Street, in the body and the choices of a 22-year-old woman who was told she would be given away and who decided instead to give herself her freedom. George Washington could not and would not free the woman who freed herself. She did it alone, and she never gave it back. No portrait of Ona Judge has ever been found. We know her face only through her words, sharp, unbroken, and free. This has been Ember and Ash. Forgotten American History.